In the past few days, many have been celebrating Joe Biden's victory as a win for the left, as a rejection of Trump's hateful rhetoric, and as a return to a better normal for America. Many are under the impression that Biden will undo many of Trump's blatant attacks on working people and minority groups, while also restoring legitimacy to many American institutions that Trump defiled in their eyes. Kamala Harris becoming not only the first woman, but the first woman of color to hold the office of vice president has similarly been hailed as a giant leap forward for the country. The mainstream consensus seems to be that brighter days are ahead under this new administration. However, as socialists and workers, we know that there is much more to this story. While the corporate media was predicting a blue wave, with Biden winning by a landslide and the Democrats taking back the Senate, it is clear that Biden only narrowly managed to win this election. And it's still unclear whether the Democrats will be able to take the Senate. So despite all of the noise about, record voter turnout, neither candidate received the majority from eligible voters, right? So, millions of people still stayed home, either unable or not inspired enough to vote for either candidate. Rather than losing votes in this election, Trump actually gained about 4 million more votes than he did in 2016, increasing among all groups except for white men. So Trump got the most Black votes of any Republican candidate since 1996 and the most Latino votes of any Republican since 2004. Despite presiding over an economic depression, a pandemic, and the largest protest movement since Occupy, Trump was still almost able to beat Biden, which should not have been possible, right? So when presented with these facts, the corporate media has no explanation, right? So one journalist, I think it was on MSNBC, explained Trump's increased success with minorities as a sign of quote unquote multicultural fascism, a term which is pretty ridiculous at face value and really does nothing to explain why so many people would vote for a campaign which blatantly does not have their interests in mind. Of course, as socialists, we understand that neither campaign had the working class's interest in mind, right? So obviously, that doesn't mean that workers should vote for Trump, right? As Trump is in no way preparing to provide any sort of relief to working people, least of all working people of color. However, when faced with a vote between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it's clear that a good amount of people could not find a firm reason to vote for Biden over Trump. And we also cannot forget that Trump's populist message of jobs and lower taxes, however false it was rhetorically more attractive than Biden's message of just not being Trump. In addition, Trump's reputation as a political outsider undoubtedly drew people disappointed with the two-party system towards him. I mean, especially people disappointed with career politicians like Joe Biden. So one narrative we've been hearing from the corporate media is that half of America is just hopelessly racist, right? That anyone who voted for Trump should just be written off as, a Southern hick who can't see their own interests. For one, this assumes that half of Americans voted for Trump, which is not true, right? Due to the undemocratic nature of our elections, only a fraction of eligible voters even end up voting. And even you don't even need, the majority of eligible voters to win the presidency because of the Electoral College and things like that. And as socialists, we don't accept this elitist explanation for why poor white people and increasingly poor non-white people were drawn to Trump, right? So while racism is part of the equation here, it is not the only factor and it is not a constant. So as socialists, we understand that being racist is not an inherent trait which people cannot change, but a result of the racism built into the capitalist system being internalized by working people. Racist beliefs are stoked by the ruling class to pit workers against each other. Malcolm X summed it up best when he said, "You can't have capitalism without racism." Racist beliefs in society can and must be fought against. And the most effective way to fight against these ideas is to expose them as tools for dividing workers against one another and by organizing multiracial movements along class lines. And we can also see that support for progressive demands and support for Trump are not mutually exclusive. So for example, in Florida, a state that Trump won pretty easily, a referendum was also passed with a pretty progressive minimum wage raise. We also know that a majority of Americans support Medicare for all, meaning that it's, impossible or that it has to be that there are people who voted for Trump yet still support Medicare for all. So it is likely that if Biden had embraced a popular policy like Medicare for all, he could have drawn away a significant amount of Trump's voters. So we should not necessarily take Trump's increased number of votes as an indication that more people are rejecting progressive policies. but rather as more people rejecting Biden and what his campaign was offering. So let's look at what Biden was offering during this election, right? So rather than running on any progressive policies, Biden was basically running on the fact that he isn't Trump. So on several occasions, when confronted with his record, Biden literally told voters not to vote for him. There was an occasion where an immigration activist confronted him on the number of deportations during his time working with Obama, and Biden told her to just go vote for Trump then. This was something that was repeated with a climate activist when they confronted him on his record with climate change. We also can't forget the time that Joe Biden said in an interview that if you're Black and you don't vote for him, then you're not Black. So I don't think anyone should have any illusions in the Biden campaign. This campaign was awful. It was terrible. It failed to motivate people to vote, and it failed to put forward any coherent position on pressing issues. And the absence of the predicted blue wave isn't because Trump, had a great message or did well. It's because the Democrats did terribly. And so I think as socialists, we need to be prepared to explain why Biden ran such a, on the surface, terrible campaign. Like I said, Biden could have endorsed Medicare for all, defunding the police, or legalizing marijuana, or any of a dozen other, extremely popular progressive demands. And he actually could have beat Trump by a landslide. And so the answer of why he didn't do this, lies in the Democratic Party, right? What it is and what it wanted to achieve through the campaign of Joe Biden. So despite the name, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone, the Democratic Party is not democratic. It is a corporate entity without a membership base, which sustains itself through, donations from wealthy individuals and corporations. So the Democratic Party is funded by the insurance companies, the fossil fuel companies, the weapons manufacturers, and therefore it's beholden to those industries. Many of the top politicians of the Democratic Party are, big capitalists themselves, like Nancy Pelosi, who owns a real estate empire built largely off of the 2008 housing crisis, giving her a vested interest, for example, in making sure housing is not a right. Because of these facts, it shouldn't be surprising that Biden ran on a platform of expanding private insurance, increasing military and police budgets, and building more pipelines. The fact is that other than Biden running on the fact that he wasn't Trump, the Biden campaign offered no alternative to the last 4 years, except on a superficial level. Biden is essentially promising to continue Trump's policies, but in a more polite and presidential way. This is fundamentally what he meant when he told a group of wealthy donors that under his administration, nothing would fundamentally change. And this question of Biden's wealthy donors is something that we need to talk about more. From the start, Biden's campaign was able to consolidate a large number of billionaires and corporate backers to the point where he had more billionaire backers than Trump did during the general election. In addition, over 500 current and former generals, admirals, and national security officials endorsed Biden's campaign. This should make it clear that Biden's campaign was much more concerned with consolidating the support of the ruling class and the state than it was with consolidating the support of the working class. While Trump tried to appeal to the disaffected and disillusioned masses, no matter how insincere he was, Biden was more focused on the upper strata of society. And we can see the effect of this strategy, in the polling numbers. And so why did the ruling class decide to back Biden over Trump? Trump's tax bill, his increased military spending, his slashing of regulations, all undoubtedly endeared him to the capitalist class. He's proven way too volatile and unpredictable for the ruling class, especially during the current crisis. Under his management, COVID-19 has completely crippled the economy, and the resurgent anti-racist movement has threatened to become a mass movement that can make radical changes to the capitalist system. The capitalist class is looking for a new figurehead which can get people out of the streets and back into the workplaces. And Joe, nothing will fundamentally change Biden, is a perfect choice for that new figurehead. So Biden almost lost to Trump because Biden was unable to offer any alternatives to the current issues people are facing today, or any answers to the current issues people are facing today. Joe Biden was chosen by the capitalist class to be a more responsible caretaker of capitalism after Trump proved too volatile. Biden and the Democrats would rather have lost to Trump than moved to the left. And as a result, the fact that both Trump and Biden are accountable to the capitalist class, not the working class. So the situation we're in right now, and that we always find ourselves in every 4 years, was summed up by Marx over 100 years ago when he said, the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representative of the oppressing class is to represent and oppress them. So was this election, a victory from the left, like the news outlets are saying? I don't think it was, at all. So in the run up to the election, the logic of lesser evilism was used to make sure no meaningful criticism of Biden could be made, right? Lest you be seen as helping Trump. This meant that large sections of the so-called American left backed and supported Biden uncritically, despite Biden not conceding anything to the left and Biden actively attacking the left. So another thing that made it so hard to tell Trump apart from Biden is that both Trump and Biden campaigned against socialism in this election. Trump accused Biden of being a radical socialist, and then Biden bragged about having beat the socialist in reference to Bernie Sanders, who also, left his principles at the door to support Biden during the general election. So if Biden's victory is a victory for the left, then what does the left have to show for it, right? So time and money that could have been spent building an independent working class party has gone into the corporate Democratic Party. People who could have been brought into politics for the first time ever to support a third party that put forward a coherent platform for working people has once again been shown that political action is useless, that the only thing they will ever have is a choice between two evils. And what about the threat of, so-called fascism from Trump? We heard a lot from the corporate media before and during the election that it was likely that Trump was going to stage some sort of coup, or even that if Trump won the election, then America would become a fascist state. And so this was used to justify a vote for Biden as a vote for, saving our democracy. And so there are a lot of things wrong with that, right? So for one, fascism is more than just a checklist where more checks means more fascism. Fascism is capitalism in decay fundamentally. When capitalism goes into crisis and the capitalist class begins to fear revolution from the left, it will empower and organize elements of the disaffected middle and lower classes into a fascist movement, whose underlying function is to protect the capitalists from the organizations of the working class. This is why every fascist government's first course of action is to smash the unions and jail the socialists. Right now in America, there is no left that is threatening the capitalist system enough for the capitalist class to back a fascist movement. We can see from the donor lists, of Trump and Biden, especially of Biden, that the capitalist class is behind Biden, right? And is still holding out hope that it will be able to restore business as usual without the need to resort to fascism. However, Biden is unable to address any of the underlying crises of capitalism. And so his president does nothing to prevent the rise of fascism further down the road. Secondly, the idea that we have a democracy to save in the first place is, laughable. So as while socialists fight to protect and expand democratic rights under capitalism, we understand that as long as political power can be bought, the capitalist class will always control our political systems. Our democracy was created by the wealthy to protect the interests of the wealthy, and the existence of institutions like the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Electoral College only cement this fact. So will the left be healthier under Biden? Some have argued that, Trump and Biden do represent two sides of the same neoliberal coin. Organizing under Biden will somehow be easier than organizing under Trump. This ignores the lessons of the Obama years, though, right? When the anti-war movement, which had been built under Bush, basically liquidated itself when Obama came into office, fooled into thinking that the Democrats would be any better than Bush. So there's a real danger that something similar will happen with the current anti-racist movement, right? Or other progressive movements that we have that might just kind of drop the fight now that the office of the president has a D next to it. What can we expect under Biden? To begin with, I think it's not unlikely that Biden will make minor concessions to working people once he gets into office. Another $1,200 check, a reversal of some of Trump's more kind of blatantly terrible policies will likely and could happen within the first few months of the Biden presidency, right? But that's not assured. If the Republicans win the Senate, it's probable that this fact will be used as an excuse on why Biden can't pass any legislation, right? And then it's likely that under the cover of so-called reaching across the aisle, which Biden is a fan of in his career, this will be used as an excuse to work with Republicans to pass legislation for corporations and not working people. While at the same time complaining that it's not the Democrats' fault because the Republicans won't let them do anything. And even if the Democrats do win the Senate, this is no assurance that Biden will use this opportunity to pass any meaningful legislation. When Obama came into office during his first term, the Democrats had control of Congress. Instead of using this opportunity to help workers and deliver on promises of universal healthcare and other progressive reforms, Obama bailed out the banks and waited until the Democrats had lost Congress to actually begin pushing his campaign promises. Ultimately, Biden will not pass any meaningful reforms that benefit the working class unless he is forced to by a mass movement, right? And this is one of the reasons that our primary drive, or one of our primary drives under the Biden administration, must be to organize these mass movements which can connect demands for healthcare, an end to imperialism, and an end to police brutality together into a force that can pry these concessions from the capitalist class and from the Biden administration. Despite Trump's reputation as an authoritarian, it is likely that Biden will be just as brutal against protesters taking part in this mass movement, right, or in any sort of movement. Just like what we saw occur under, during the Occupy movement, during the first rounds of BLM, and the indigenous protests under Obama. In some ways, Biden might even pose a greater threat to activists, right? As many people who beforehand defended protesters against Trump will now be silent as Biden, does exactly what Trump does, but under the label of a more kind of progressive Democratic administration. A Biden presidency also likely means an escalation of hawkish foreign policy. While no dove, Trump appeared anxious to get involved in additional foreign conflicts while he was in office. While he engaged in saber rattling with America's official enemies, we saw nothing on the level of Bush's invasion of Iraq or Obama's bombing of Libya while Trump was in office. This was actually something that Biden ran on, right? He ran to the right on this, claiming that he would be tougher on America's official enemies. So if Biden's presidency is anything like Obama's, we will see a dramatic increase in the number of foreign conflicts America is engaged in, along with a corresponding increase in military spending, which is something that Biden has already promised he will do, is raise the military budget. Domestically, Biden's policies will likely be a continuation of Trump's policies, which themselves were a continuation of Biden's policies via the Obama administration. There's no reason to expect Biden to free the kids in cages because Biden was one of the people that built those cages under Obama. There's no reason to expect Biden to be kind to the anti-racist movement after he pledged to give more money to the police and picked a self-proclaimed top cop to be his running mate. So Biden has already floated the idea that he would allow Republicans to serve in his presidential cabinet, further showing, how willing Biden is to move to the right rather than to the left. Excuse me. So the idea that, we are going to convince Biden to move to the left when he's shown time and time again that all he wants to do is, move to the right and work with the Republicans and give the Republicans everything they want. It's absurd to think that this is going to be something that we can just convince him to do, right? The Biden administration on the whole is going to be an administration of austerity, bailouts and tax cuts for the super wealthy, and civil repression unless a united independent left can organize against him. So I think we need to be realistic about what a Biden presidency means, but by no means should we lose hope. The coming period is incredibly promising if we play our cards right. The result of this election should be final proof to anyone who claims to be on the left that the Democrats are a dead end. Far from being a party of the left, the Democrats are the single biggest obstacle to the left in America and the single biggest obstacle to an organized working class. More than ever, we need to be advocating for and helping to create an independent party of the working class. The hunger for a third party that represents ordinary people exists. We saw it in the polling numbers. We saw it in people saying that they want a third party when asked. And this party would not be like the Democrats and Republicans. It would need to have the support of the trade unions and actively be working to unionize ever-increasing segments of the working class. This party would need to be membership-based, with members democratically deciding the party platform and funding the platform through paying dues. The members of this party, the representatives and the candidates of this party would need to be actually accountable to the people they represent, right? They would need to be immediately recallable and take these, the salary of the average worker that they represent.
5 minutes.
So thank you. Another crucial task before us is intervening in and organizing mass movements, which can force concessions from Biden and the rest of the capitalist class. Even if the new anti-racist movement dies down or is crushed by Biden, the capitalist system has entered a period of crisis that is not going to be able to exit without making, some serious changes. you can see, what is going on right now. We have COVID-19, which is still unresolved and getting worse in a lot of the industrialized world, getting worse in the United States. We have the economic crisis that COVID-19 has pushed the country in. And in addition to the, resurgent anti-racist movement, in the beginning of this year, amid COVID-19, we saw more union actions in the beginning of this year than we have in, the past few years combined. Now more than ever, especially with the phenomenon of, so-called essential workers, people can see that what keeps society running is not, the billionaires and the, large corporations and the CEOs, but it is the working class. And, fundamentally, it's the segments of the working class that are usually paid, worse than the other segments, right? The essential workers, the fast food workers, the transit workers, all of those. So people are, hungry for socialist ideas. And if we are able to provide those ideas and build on that, build a mass movement, build a third independent workers' party, we can get concessions from the capitalist class. This can be a period of great gains, but we have to fight for it, right? We cannot have any illusions in Biden or in the Democratic Party. No election, especially no election of capitalist politicians, is going to save us. So one of the main points, of electing Biden and, what people were hoping for in Biden getting a landslide was that legitimacy would be restored to, the current system. People seeing, 200,000 Americans dying, seeing at one point 1 in 10 people in this country were at risk of foreclosure, people can tell, instinctually that capitalism is not working, that the current political system is not working. And so one of the points of trying to elect Biden and have this blue wave was to restore faith into our system, right? To give it legitimacy. That's why we saw so many corporations, running ads encouraging people to vote. It's not because, Pfizer or Bank of America, actually cares about what your vote is. It's because they want you to feel like you have a stake in this system and like this system is working, right? But it's not working. We can see it's not working. Ultimately, this election was unable to restore legitimacy to the capitalist system in the way the ruling class was hoping. But we can't always rely on this to be the case, right? Just because this crisis exists now does not mean it's going to exist forever. We need to be prepared to seize opportunities at a moment's notice when they arise. And for this, we need to be organized, right? So this meeting is a great first step. But I encourage everyone here, if you're not a member of ISG, continue the conversation with us. Consider becoming a member, talk with us further, and come in and ask, questions during the discussion. I think the things we need to be discussing are how can we show people what the results of this election were in a way that gets people ready, to continue organizing, to continue working. I think there's a segment of the population who is ready to, quote unquote, go back to brunch. But there's also another segment who is looking at the results of this election, especially at the increased votes for Trump, and feeling very disheartened and feeling very hopeless. But we shouldn't be feeling hopeless, right? We should be ready to organize. We should be ready to fight. And we should be ready to win things like Medicare for all, like a real Green New Deal, like the progressive things that we as working people need, not just because they're nice ideas, but because we need them fundamentally to survive. And so I think that we should be hopeful and we should be, ready to put in the work into this new period to, get the things that we need. And so with that, I look forward to hearing the discussion and answering any questions that come up in the sum up. It was a lot to talk about, so I'm sorry if bits of it were a little discombobulated, but thank you so much all for being here. And I look forward to the discussion. So thank you.